Hi there, my name is Sean Sherman. I am the CEO and founder of the Sioux Chef and our nonprofit Natives, or North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And I'm going to be here today to talk to you guys a little bit about the journey and the path that we've taken to get to what we're doing. It's been a crazy few years. We've done a lot. We've been able to make a lot happen in a very short time, and starting from pretty much nothing. And I'm just going to talk about that. So if you're not familiar with our work, we focus on North American indigenous foods, and it's been a long journey of trying to understand that. So myself, I am from Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. All my family was born and raised on the reservation, and a lot of this work came from a very much a personal journey to get here, because I'd been a chef for a while. I grew up in restaurants, so I started cooking at a very young age. My mom moved us, my sister and myself, off the reservation when just before I started high school, and we moved to a small town in South Dakota called Spearfish, which is in the northern Black Hills, right on the edge of Wyoming. And I started working in restaurants when I had just barely turned 13, and I just kind of continued that journey for quite a few years. So I worked restaurants all through high school, after high school and through college, and then after college I moved to Minneapolis and continued to work restaurants and kind of moved my way up into a chef position. And it's been a long, hard journey because like a lot of families on the reservation, we didn't have a lot of financial means. So my mom worked really hard to raise my sister and myself, and she had very little. And so that was part of the reason why I think I had a pretty good work ethic. And it was just really interesting. So growing up in the restaurants, I started off in the Black Hills just doing a lot of basic steakhouse kind of foods. So I think the first restaurant I worked at was called the Sluice, and it was a mining themed restaurant. And I remember we had a sluice box salad bar was the gimmick. But it was all pretty much the same menu across the board. Everybody had things like prime rib and baked potatoes, and it wasn't that interesting. And I didn't really learn about cooking until I got into Minneapolis and started working in restaurants there, and started expanding my palate a lot, started reading a lot more about cooking. And for me it was a very personal education, because I didn't go to culinary school. I just worked really hard, and I had been working restaurants for so long that I moved my way up really quickly. And a few years of being a chef, I had the realization of the work that we're doing today, which is this focus on indigenous foods. Because even though I grew up within a tribal community on a reservation, even the third largest reservation in the United States, I had very little knowledge of what my own ancestors were eating. And as I dug a little bit deeper, I realized that this was a normal situation, unfortunately, and that was out there, that many of us have very little idea what is Native American food, and and many people have very little education about Native American people in general. So it really was eye-opening for myself to realize that even though I'd been studying food for so long, I realized that I knew very little. I could only name a handful of indigenous recipes, and that weren't brought together with other cultures. So I just was really curious as to what were my personal ancestors eating. Were they trading? What was their knowledge of the food around them and the world around them, really, when it came down to it? So I just started really researching, and I spent a few years just really kind of digging in to try and understand that. So one job that I had in particular that stands out was right out of high school. I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, and then even though I was really low there, I was a field surveyor, but part of my job was to learn all the plants in the northern Black Hills, which really helped me out much later to know that that knowledge was out there, and know that there's so much to learn, and there's so many plants with so many uses out there. And that's something that I was looking for with my indigenous ancestry and heritage and knowledge, because I knew that my indigenous ancestors had a vast grasp on the world around them, because they had thousands of generations of people before them passing down this information of how to live sustainably utilizing plants and animals of their region, and what to do with the plants and how to safeguard the plants and to put a lot of respect into the plants, and how to make sure that you're harvesting the right parts and you're not damaging these plant colonies and plant families, because these plant families have been with us for such a long time. We just, as indigenous peoples, we can look at them as our extended family, because they're a part of our culture. They're a part of who we are. Our parents, our grandparents grew up with them, our great-great-grandparents, and so forth, for thousands of generations before me and before us. So it's been a really interesting journey, because there was not a lot of books out there. I always joke that I couldn't just go and order Joy of Native American Cooking, because it didn't exist, and I had to really dig deep to try to understand what was an indigenous food system and how to identify that. And not only that, but how can I eventually apply it to an entrepreneurship business, and how can we move forward with a modern sense of indigenous foods while holding on to the values of it. So through all this journey, it's so interesting, because you have to understand a lot of history, and people just don't realize the history of the land that they're standing on, because of just the way colonization works and the way that history books are written, and the way that high school and young age education is given to us, that we learn very little about indigenous communities and indigenous histories, and especially from their perspectives. So I think it's a really important piece to all of this, is to understand a lot of the hardships that we went through as indigenous peoples and the very short time frame of these histories. So I always like to start, talking about some of the terms that we use, like pre-colonial foods and decolonization. And I realize that some people don't even really understand what the word colonialism really means. And why is that even a bad thing? So to define colonialism, it's just the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically, is the basic definition. And it's something that we have seen all over the U.S., of course, of what is the U.S. today, all over Canada, all over North America in general, but all over the world. So you see these colonized routes happening everywhere, especially coming out of Europe, affecting South America, North America, all of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and all these indigenous cultures around the globe are sharing this common history of pain, of destruction, of genocide, loss of land, loss of ways, loss of knowledge, loss of education, and it's really damaging. But we feel like right now, with the part of the work that we're doing with our nonprofit, is really trying to understand and preserve a lot of this knowledge for the future, because we see a global knowledge base of indigenous peoples everywhere that carries so much commonality with how we could be eating more diverse food systems that are extremely hyper locally grown, utilizing a mixture of agriculture and permacultural designs, and just really opening up our palate, because the Western colonized diet has rarely taken into account what is local to all these different regions on a global scale. So especially here in the U.S., where I'm right in Minnesota, in Minneapolis today, and people use very little of actually what's outside and what's around us. So much of our food system is coming from all over the place, is coming from too far, and we know that there's very destructive farming practices happening, and we should really be focused on how indigenous peoples were being able to thrive. So cultures that had agriculture, which is a huge area of North America, Central America, and South America, growing all sorts of diverse crops of corns and beans and squash and chilies and sunflower, and there's just so much diversity within those crops, and they were such amazing staples to be able to have a base of food system for nourishment, for trade, and for all of those pieces, but also the commonalities of indigenous peoples on this global scale, having that ability to have this vast knowledge of the wild plants around them for everything. Because plants are food, plants are medicine, plants you can craft with, and these plants carry all these qualities. So I think it's just really important that we look at the importance of that, but it's also important, I feel like, that we think about, the short history of the United States. So if you look at the United States in the year 1800, like we haven't grown much from the 13 colonies that started us, and we're still at war with Great Britain in 1800, and this isn't ancient history. So even though European powers had took vast claims of huge swaths of North America, the reality was indigenous peoples were still living there the way they always had for thousands of generations. And I think it's really important for us to understand how indigenous peoples survived and thrived in all these diverse regions, because it's a real important part of how we can all kind of work towards a better understanding of our own regional identity, and just taking into account a lot of these kind of historic and horrific wrongs that happened in history to make sure that they don't happen again. So our work is kind of hitting a couple of fronts all at once. So there's a lot of education involved. It's a lot of talking about, how the U.S. government has been throughout the 1800s was extremely destructive towards indigenous peoples. So from the beginning of the 1800s, where over 80% of the landmass is occupied and still stewarded by indigenous peoples, by the end of that century, less than 3% of that space is held by indigenous peoples only because of the reservation systems. And so much happens in the 1800s, which is, for a lot of us indigenous peoples, is just very short history, because this is our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents' generation, and it's not that far back. So I think about my great-grandfather, because he was the last generation in my family to carry a full indigenous education. So, we take the time to identify that term also. What is indigenous education? So indigenous education for us just means those thousands of generations of knowledge pieces being handed down, again, how to live sustainably utilizing plants and animals around us, and all of the pieces that come in, that are a part of that, like, how are people crafting, how are they gathering, all of that. So it's really important for us to understand that, again, like this history or this education hasn't been gone for that long, because myself, I was born in 1974, and 100 years prior to my birth, all of my Lakota ancestors still carried 100% of their education, because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills until 1876. So within less than a century, so much education is wiped off the map. So by the time I'm growing up in the 1970s and 80s, I know very, very little about the true indigenous education, and especially when it comes to surviving utilizing plants and animals and a lot of those techniques. We did grow up harvesting some things. We still gathered the wild prairie turnip, which we called timsala. We gathered a lot of choke cherries. There was a lot of juniper around us. There was a lot of cactus and cactus fruit. And we just lived in a very interesting, area, because the Pine Ridge Reservation sits right on the edge of the Badlands and into the Badlands a little bit, and on the Great Plains, and we're on the border between South Dakota and Nebraska. And there's a lot of sand hills. There's a lot of thorns. It's really sandy soil, and it's just it's a really interesting place. But then we're right also next to the Black Hills, which is a very sacred spot for Lakota. And I spent a lot of summers in that area, which was mostly coniferous pine forest, spruce trees, and just a lot of rolling hills. And even though they're not like the Rocky Mountains, they're pretty tall, so there's lots of canyons and creeks, and it was a really interesting, even more diverse area of different kinds of foods than you would find around the Badlands area of South Dakota. So anyways, as I think about my indigenous ancestors and the foods that they were eating, those questions that I had, like what were they growing, how were they harvesting things, and how are they, who are they trading with, and how are they processing foods, and just looking at everything through kind of an indigenous culinary lens and trying to understand it all. And eventually, having enough education and knowledge at a certain point that I really thought it was going to be important to try and start some kind of business. So my original idea was to just open up a restaurant featuring indigenous foods, because I thought that would be a great platform for people to start to realize how much amazing foods there are in today's world. And this journey has taken us on quite a few different turns, because we've done quite a bit. My partner Dana Thompson and I, we opened up a food truck with the Little Earth tribal community here in Minneapolis, which is an urban native community. And we called the food truck Tatanka Truck. And we were serving only regional indigenous foods. We cut out colonial ingredients, so we stopped utilizing or using dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, even beef, pork, and chicken, just to showcase all the diversity of the foods that were already here on this land space, especially coming from tribal communities. So we prioritized trying to purchase from indigenous food producers first. We utilized a lot of wild foods that we would harvest or have work with friends who were harvesting and be able to collect and preserve a lot of different kinds of just plant pieces to use in our foods. And because we weren't typical, like there was no sodas or anything like that in the cuisine, so we were using wild cedar and maple tea. We were using wild bergamot or hyssop, and just making a lot of drinks that were showcasing this land that we were on. And I think it's really important, as we move forward, that we, really think about this space that we live in. Depending, it doesn't matter which part of where we are. You just think about the plant life around us, the history, how indigenous people survived with all these different food pieces, and it becomes hyper local, and there's so much to play with. So we've had a lot of fun over the past few years traveling around and being able to experiment with different regions. And because the food tastes different whether you're in the Northeast, if you're in Massachusetts, or if you're in South Carolina, or if you're in Florida or Texas or Arizona or Alaska or Mexico. Like everywhere you go, like it's a whole different food system. And on top of that, the diversity of indigenous peoples is immense. There's still 573 tribes in the US, 634 in Canada, and 20% of Mexico still identifies as indigenous. So there's so much indigeneity alive today. It's a really great way to understand just all of our regional diversity when it comes to people, to just language, and food systems. So I think it's a really good place to start, but it's important to see that we can still do this style of food in today's world. And I think it's really important, because once we started working on this, all the fads that were out there really seemed to kind of wash away, because what really seemed important was how indigenous communities had already figured this out, and how my direct ancestry had already figured this out, of how to live sustainably. And it took a lot of effort, it took a lot of work, because everybody was chipping into this food system. Like everybody was working hard. People were hunting, people were fishing, people were growing gardens and farming, people were collecting and saving their seeds, and it was all this tradition of how to do everything and creating clothing, creating shelters, creating tools, creating hunting implements, all of this knowledge. It's so important, because it took a whole community to process foods. And as we started researching and looking around, we started working with museums and looking at some of their holdings of some of the cool things that they had collected over the years, and realized that all these holdings, like every single piece touches food some way or another, because there's all these baskets for holding things, and all these cookware pieces, tools and utensils for rice, for processing wild rice and collecting it, for hunting, for fishing. And just every single piece was touching food. And it just goes to show that with community effort, we can really think about a better way to utilize a better system when it comes to regional food systems. And we can mimic a lot of this knowledge off of indigenous peoples, and we can do this on a global scale, because obviously, like I said, there's indigenous peoples everywhere, and there's just so much diversity to pull out of it. So as we started our small businesses with the food truck, with our catering operation, there became a lot of interest out there. We put together the cookbook, which came out in late 2017, which I wrote with my friend Beth Dooley. It was just something that we just wanted to get out there for education purposes, because we felt like there just really wasn't something of that manner out there in the world, and there really should be, because we should live in a world where we have indigenous restaurants in every single region. Every single city should be featuring indigenous peoples, communities, and histories and foods from all over the place. And we have this vision of helping to make that happen. So as we drive across the nation, one day, hopefully we can find these small indigenous food businesses, stop at them and support them, and learn so much about the regional foods of all these different areas. So with the work of our nonprofit, which is Natives, which is our 501c3, we created that in 2018 is when we got our 501c3 status, but it took a solid year of putting it together, since we didn't really come from the nonprofit world and there was a lot to learn, and we just really wanted to be careful and to do it right. So we really kind of took our time and talked with a lot of people and reached out to a lot of friends and networks, and really just kind of slowly moved forward with it. But we eventually got our status, and we eventually were able to start to grow, and we're just now starting officially, really. So we just found a space for our nonprofit, where we launched our nonprofit kitchen, which is called Indigenous Food Lab, here in Minneapolis. And with Indigenous Food Lab, our vision is pretty broad, but it really boils down to two pieces. So we really want to impact indigenous food systems and indigenous communities, because like how I grew up, where I was removed from my indigenous foods, and so were my parents and even my grandparents, and I just really wanted to do something to help make that situation better. And for myself personally, growing up with the commodity food program, I want hopefully to impact our indigenous communities to someday be able to take that over, because we should be offering indigenous foods to indigenous communities, because it's part of who we are. It's, our food is important. Food is cultural identity, no matter who you are. And I think it's going to be really important to help bring this back to these diverse indigenous communities that are all over today is the U.S. and all over Canada and Alaska and Mexico and eventually everywhere. So the vision with Indigenous Food Lab is that we have a nonprofit kitchen. We are in high production mode, so we're actually just about ready to push out about 13,000 meals just in one single week. We've been doing 6,000 meals a week as of recently, and sending these healthy indigenous meals directly out to tribal communities to kind of help give people a better backup of healthy indigenous foods to choose from, knowing that there are very little nutritional situations out there for people, especially on tribal communities, because some of these really rural tribes, like they might have just a gas station and the closest grocery store might be 40 miles away at the most. And we live in a pretty harsh environment here in Minnesota, and especially some of those tribes way up north. It can be really hard to get any kind of nutrition. So, try eating healthy off of a gas station for a month and a half and see how you feel. And, there's still like so much segregation going on in these food systems, and so much just racial inequality when it comes down to it, and it shouldn't be like that. So with our Indigenous Food Lab, we want to be a training and development center, so we're happy that we're being able to send all this food out there to support a lot of these families all over our region, but we really want to help these communities be able to do this for themselves. So part of our work is something that we're doing right now also is working with tribal communities and helping them to develop their own focused indigenous kitchens, and utilizing our nonprofit kitchen as a training center, a development center, where we can work with them to develop recipes and menus, utilizing their language and the foods around them that are historical and regional and cultural appropriate to them, and help them create something that's modern, that's easy to do. And then eventually we're going to play a role of just support, because we know that culinary businesses and culinary operations can be difficult, and we just want to create a training center for people to be able to process this kind of food. And once we have trained kitchens rolling, we'll have the opportunity to implement more education into those communities as we develop more education and curriculum around foodways. We can connect these communities with indigenous seeds that could be particular to their region, help them understand how to grow out community gardens and everything that goes into that, help them to understand how to grow more diverse permacultural design land spaces, because we should be landscaping for the purpose of food for this next generation. I think it's going to be really important that we really think critically about the land that we have and how to protect it and how to really truly utilize it as our indigenous ancestors had always been doing anyways. And to get that knowledge back into tribal communities, we can help them connect to groups that would be happy to show them how to create a diverse landscape utilizing all sorts of biodiversity that could be utilized for food, for medicine, and for some cultural crafting and arts and things like that too. But having this kitchen that will be trained on what to do with this. You know, what do you do with 50 pounds of choke cherries when you get them, or what do you do with high bush cranberries, or how many different ways can you process wild rice? And you know, just understanding how to set up kitchens that can really utilize the world around us. So our goal is to mimic this Indigenous Food Lab model and open up Indigenous food labs in cities all over the nation, and each one to become a regional center point for the same, to share the same education and training, development, and support. So if we open up a food lab in Seattle or Denver or Albuquerque or Boston or Oklahoma City or wherever they might be, each one becomes that regional center point to train, to help develop more tribal community food service operations. On top of that, just being a place for training more indigenous chefs and connecting more indigenous chefs to indigenous growers, to indigenous harvesters. And you know, we just really see a clear path of how to make this happen utilizing a simple education kitchens program. So that's Indigenous Food Lab, and we are hoping that we will eventually, or we know that eventually we're going to be able to cross these colonial borders and open up Indigenous food labs in Canada, in Mexico, in Alaska, in Hawaii, in South America, in Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, you name it. Like, we'll be able to work and create these educational centers on a global scale. Because it's out there, and this might not even happen within my lifetime, but it's thinking that far ahead to make sure that we're kind of trying to set up what the work that we're doing right now is not an ego-driven project, and it's really about how can we create a better situation and how can we utilize the land space better and the knowledge of the land space. And part of the best way to do that is to tap into this indigenous knowledge base that happens to be all around us everywhere we look, you know. So I think it's just going to be really important for people to be super critical about the businesses that they are thinking about starting, you know, because so many food businesses and so many food just, you know, personalities that I've come across over the past few years have really been just a lot of these big ego projects. And I think we need to think past ourselves. You know, we need to think about how can we be healthier, you know, because you don't need to learn how to make a 6,000 calorie hamburger with all sorts of different kinds of bacon and mayonnaise and cheese and all sorts of fried things. Like, we should be really focused on health. We should be really focused on understanding how to live within our environment, you know, because there's so much around us all the time. There's so much knowledge in the plants and the trees, and we can really make this happen. So part of our business model is prioritizing purchasing from indigenous vendors first. So here in Minnesota, we've been able to buy a lot of wild rice, a lot of different kinds of maple and corn. We've been working with local indigenous-run farming businesses and being able to purchase a lot of indigenous produce there. And with this program now, even though we've only had Indigenous Food Lab open since July this last year in Minneapolis, we've been able to purchase tens of thousands of dollars to push back into indigenous food production. And I think it's going to be really important to support that. And I've always ran in, you know, organic indigenous restaurant situations and have cut out a lot of those big food trucks and you know, food suppliers, because it's important to think super hyper local. It's important to have a really diverse group of people that you purchase from, and to always be on the lookout to see how you can support more local food businesses, because I think the pandemic has really showed us how vulnerable we are and how fragile our food systems are, and we really need to be focused on health and nutrition. And nutrition and health should not be a zip code issue. So that's a big part of why we just want to help make this change, just by getting this education out there, just carving a path and showing how it can be done right now today, creating a team of highly trained, highly productive indigenous chefs, and showcasing all over how we can be doing this everywhere, and training ourselves and understanding that, we have a lot to learn ourselves. Like, we are nowhere near the end of this education, and I probably will never see the end of this education before my own lifetime. But that's okay, because all we're trying to do is just set it up for this next generation, and the generation after them. And I think indigenous peoples have always thought that, with the stories of thinking 7 generations ahead, that we should be really thinking about that with everything that we do moving forward. So as we're trying to build a foundation and structure for the next generation, we just want this next generation of kids, who are eventually going to be leaders, to have this education about their own indigenous foods, to understand like how that's going to make them and their body feel compared to fast foods and overprocessed foods, and the cultural importance of preserving this knowledge and education. And as we're working through a lot of this, we are hoping that a lot of our education and curriculum that we're developing through Indigenous Food Lab will also be we'll be able to do this bilingually. We hired our education director. His name is Armando, and Armando is from Bolivia, and we're really excited because we were really hoping that we could find somebody to help us, bridge these colonial language barriers. Because for us, it doesn't matter who's speaking English or Spanish or French in the Americas, because those are all colonial languages. But those are the languages that we need to utilize to help reach as many indigenous peoples out there as possible. So I think education in health and growing is such an important phase for where we are today and how we can move forward. And ourselves, even though we're putting a lot of effort into this nonprofit mission and vision, we also still have our for-profit businesses that we are growing and slowly moving forward. So we are just finally about to open our first restaurant in Minneapolis this year, and it's been a long time coming and a long time building, and we're really excited to be able to do something with a lot of intention to really showcase the history of the land that we're going to be on. So we're going to be right downtown Minneapolis, right on the Mississippi River, right in a really sacred and important space for both Dakota and Anishinaabe communities. And the Dakota name for this place is called Owanimi, so the name of our restaurant is going to be called Owamini. We're going to be opening in late May. And again, we're using the same model that we set up from the beginning. So we're trying to showcase and feature indigenous foods. We cut out a lot of colonial ingredients again, so there's no dairy, no flour, no sugar, so it makes us extremely dietary friendly, because we're gluten-free, sugar-free, soy-free, we're pork-free, dairy-free. And it's easy to think about that, and it's not even that we're pushing healthy foods. It's just that this food happens to be extremely flavorful and healthy, and it's just, again, super hyper local, because we're gathering so many of these ingredients from people around us, and we're creating a huge demand around it, and it can be done, and the space that we're creating is going to be largely outdoor, so we feel like it's post-pandemic safe. And we have to be really, really critical for that too, because it's a whole different world out there for food businesses at this very moment, because the pandemic just threw the whole food industry on its head, and people are still trying to understand what's next after spending everything they've known in their lifetime to have it completely turned around on them. And the best thing we can do is move forward, and so I feel lucky because we're working really hard with our nonprofit vision, and when everything crazy happened this year, with not only the pandemic, but where our Indigenous Food Lab kitchen is in Minneapolis, it's in a building called the Midtown Global Market. right on Lake Street, and it's right less than a mile away from where the George Floyd murder happened, and we're right on the main center point of where a lot of the destruction happened with all of when the social uprising started. So a lot of the buildings around us were completely razed to the ground. So we got our staff together and just started making foods, because we knew that there was even more food insecurity out there, not only because of the pandemic, but because so much destruction just happened to our community. And we were just doing whatever we could to help out. So back then we were pushing out 400 meals a day, making these healthy indigenous grain bowls, and just unapologetically serving healthy food out there, because we need healthy food out there, because so many of these communities were getting food support, but then they're also like, what do we do with like this huge garbage bag filled with stale bread that people are feeding us, and we want to make sure that people have fresh veggies. And so the money that we raised to do that, we were able to create something healthy, and all this money is also being directed to our local food system. So we're purchasing tens of thousands of dollars in local foods and produce and meats and grains. And I think it's really important that whatever we do moving forward, that we take this time to reset, to change the way we think about where our food is coming from and the foods that we're serving people, and thinking about the health of our customers. I think gone are the days of, hopefully gone are the days of people just serving factory fried chicken to people because it's cheap and it's easy to cook and people like it because it's filled with all sorts of sodiums and sugars and MSGs and you name it. But I think that, we really need to think about what's healthy. We really need to, make a change in the world right now, today, and make people understand that, healthy, interesting, creative foods isn't, doesn't have, you don't have to have, millions of dollars to be able to appreciate having access to nutrition and creativity when it comes to food. That, food is beautiful, can be creative, and food should be accessible to everybody. And if we focused more on regional indigenous food systems, by utilizing diverse agricultural systems, by utilizing all this permaculture design and wild foods and all these techniques, that we can really get there. It's going to be completely doable. And it's going to be interesting to see a lot of the more indigenous chefs come out of this, but it's also going to be interesting to see non-indigenous peoples to how they're going to really start to understand the value and the importance of this knowledge, and how we're hoping that we're going to see the influence out there of people utilizing and understanding how to use more of this food around us, and not just destroying plant colonies, but understanding how the plants work, how our local environment works, and how we can utilize this better, and start to have more diverse food production and more regional production that will make us completely stand out. And that's how we're going to evolve, and making food accessible to everybody. It's just there's a lot of needs out there. There's a lot of food needs, and this year really made it just so obvious that we need to help each other. We need to do everything we can to help our community. And if we really focused on working hard together as communities, utilizing open land spaces, working with cities who could help us turn around buildings into kitchens that could process food, and get it to people that need food, like we could do a lot. There's a lot of resources out there. We just have to understand how to be more efficient about it, and how do we change our ways. And I think that's a really important part of this situation, because when it comes to foods and farming and land ownership, like it's still not very diverse at all. So if you look at the statistic, it's still 98% of all privately owned land is still owned and operated by European descendant white owners, and that's a direct result of what happened in the 1800s with this massive theft of indigenous land spaces, and this push for, kind of justified genocide that happened across the nation. And there's a lot of, the United States government has never come to terms with how it became this global power by commodifying all this stolen land on top of, stealing a lot of indigenous peoples from Africa and forcing them to build so much stuff. So there's just a lot of work and a lot of reparations that are going to have to happen coming up. And, we want to be a voice in that. We want to it's important for us to know our true histories and to not shy away from some of the things that are hurtful and harmful, because this is the history that we all share right now together. You can try to hide it, but it's still there. So it's better to talk about it, because that's how we can heal trauma moving forward. And, it's going to take a lot of effort, but, I think that with the work that we're doing and the team that we're building and the partners and networks that we're creating around the nation and everywhere else in the world, that this is doable. Like, we can make this happen. So I'm just hoping that, people will appreciate this effort that we're trying to do. And I hope that people reach out to us and that we can grow and that we can find more partners to help create more indigenous food labs around the nation, and to find people who can help us where we need help, to find groups and people who can help us, understand how to help these tribal communities develop permacultural designs. I've been working a lot with seed saving groups, and I think it's really important to have a lot of access to these indigenous heirloom seeds, and to be able to protect them and to be able to, teach the importance of these seeds moving forward. And I think that, a lot of people out there, this is the challenge. Like, this is what we have to do, and like, how can you challenge yourselves with the business ideas that you have to really make sure that it's something that can last, that's going to be an impact, not just for yourself financially or egotistically, but, how is this really going to affect people in the future, and especially people that you directly touch, your own family, your friends, and your community. And I think that's where that change is, that has to happen. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm going to attach a little cooking video just to showcase some of the work that we do. And if anybody has any questions, I hope you guys can reach out. You can find us on our websites. There's either sioux-chef.com, which is SIOUX-chef.com, or you can also find us on natifs.org, and that's natifs.org. And again, that's the acronym North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. So I hope you guys, once this pandemic lightens up, can come visit us at Indigenous Food Lab, and we hope to open up Indigenous food labs in cities everywhere. So Wopila, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for listening.
Matakiape, my name is Sean Sherman. We are here today. We're going to be making some healthy indigenous food recipes that you guys will be able to do right at home. You should be able to find most of these ingredients in your local grocery stores, but you could also find some of these out in the wild. We have 3 recipes that we're going to be going through. We're going to be making a very simple tea out of all of this, which is just going to be a maple and conifer tea that you can drink hot or iced. We're also going to be making a dish utilizing bison, and we're just going to be letting it slow cook until it's really fall apart, almost like a pot roast. And then we're also going to be cooking off one of these. This is a Lakota squash. This will be a really fun one to utilize. And other than that, I think we should probably just get cooking. This next dish, again, is a very simple one that you can do at home. Because all we're doing is just taking a pot of water, and we're just gonna throw some of this stuff in. So this is some of the blue spruce. It smells like a spruce tree. And this pine, and there's still some sap on here. It's a little sticky even. Just like the whole branch, it's fine. Just throw it all in there. And then we're also going to be throwing in white cedar, which is really my favorite. Not only can you use this for tea, but you can also use this to cook in. So maybe you're poaching something, or maybe you're using this liquid to cook down some meat in. Basically, that's all we're going to do is just throw this stuff in here, turn it on, put it on the stove, turn it on to a simmer, and just let it go for probably like 40 minutes. It's just going to be really simple. So let's check out this tea. I'm just going to take a little bit of, again, pure maple, and then we're just going to dip in and get some tea. Give it a little bit of a stir. If you wanted to, you can always just garnish it with a little tiny piece of cedar. And the same thing, if you wanted to do ice, you could let it obviously cool at room temperature, or you could just pour it right over some ice right there. And that's going to melt that ice really quickly. And again, a little bit of maple. Not much more than a tablespoon. You don't need a lot of sweetener. It's not like a soda that has 28 grams of sugar or something like that. You just need a little bit just to open it up. Stir this just a little bit. You can see that color. It's just so good, so refreshing. First, we're going to start with the cedar braised bison dish, and we're basically going to make this like a pot roast. I'm just going to put this big chunk of meat, but I'm just going to put this right in the pot. I'm going to get a little bit of salt and sprinkle it directly on the meat. I'm going to use a little bit of sumac also for seasoning. And then basically we're just going to use some of this great vegetable. And if you're doing this at home, it's going to be great because after it's cooking for a while, you're really going to smell all of that wonderful aroma coming off of it. If you have access to other kinds of meats, you could use venison, you could use elk, you could use moose, you could use all sorts of different kinds of other proteins. And I'm going to cut up this really wonderful, locally grown sweet potato, and I'm just making big chunks and really simple because I just want it to slow cook. And it's just going to be a wonderful, basically one pot dish that you'll be able to enjoy for most of your whole family. And this is the turnip. We do have access to wonderful locally grown turnips, and is going to taste really awesome in this dish too. So just throwing this in there. We're going to use some of these sunchokes. And these guys just have such a cool shape. You know, I just love keeping them simple and just cutting them up so you can see some of that cool shape when it's just these big chunks. It's just a really fun piece to use. But again, we'll just break it down so it's just nice pieces that will look good on the plate. And then I am going to use a little bit of the cedar, since this is cedar braised bison. This is pure maple that's grown here in Minnesota. Pure maple is really important. You don't want to use the fake maple because it's got too strong of a flavor and it's not real food. So, and the last piece that we're going to do here is just fill this up so the water just barely comes to the top, just over the meat and just over everything else. And that is pretty much it. And then we're just going to put this right into the oven. I'm going to cook this at 300 degrees for about 5 hours. All right, I'm just going to pull this out of the oven. So let's see what it looks like. Oh yeah, it looks awesome. And it smells really good. I can see the meat is totally falling apart and it's perfect. So let's just plate this up, move the cedar out of the way. These veggies are completely broken down, which is great. Look at that. And this stuff is literally falling apart right here. You can see that, it's just breaking apart. So perfect. I'm gonna take some of the cedar and I'm just gonna chop it up and sprinkle it right over. And voila, one pot meal. If you want a little texture, you could always just throw something like some pepitas or something on it because it'll just give it a little crunch as you're going through. But this is beautiful right now, so perfect. Alrighty. For this recipe, we're going to cut up this squash. And this is a big guy, so it might take me a moment. But first, I just like to trim the edges a little bit first. That way it gives you a flat surface to work with when you're cutting, like so. And I'm just going to cut it right down the middle. You want to be very careful when you're cutting these open because they're extremely large. And you can see like how awesome this is, and see all these seeds. Like you can save them to put them in your own gardens at home. So it's just really simple to cut that out. And then all we're going to do is just take this squash after it's nice and just using a spoon and just scraping it just a little bit. We're just going to cut this into pieces to roast. So I'm going to start by cutting it in half again, this way. And one more time, quartering it. And then I'm just going to make nice kind of quarter moons basically out of this whole squash. And they don't need to be too thick, but you don't want them to be too thin either. Just going to finish this off. Okay. All right, so then all I'm going to do is going to take a sheet pan here, and I'm just going to layer them out. It's very simple like. And it's okay if they stack up just a tiny bit, but you want it to be mostly single layered if you can. And we're going to use a little bit of, since we have this sunflower oil here, just going to drizzle a little bit right on top of the squash. I'm going to add a little bit of salt, just a tiny bit. And since I'm using stuff from my own indigenous pantry here, I'm going to use some of this fresh sumac that we made ourselves too, and just sprinkle it right on the squash. And all we're going to do is just put this right in the oven. I'm going to bake it at 375, and I'm going to bake it for, it's probably going to take about 35 minutes. And we'll just, we'll keep an eye on it though, so I'll set a timer. We are going to be making a very simple pesto. I'm just going to take, let's just say, we'll have these recipes written out, but we'll say it's about a quarter cup of sunflower seed, maybe about the same for pumpkin seed. I'm going to use a little bit of this hemp seed, which you, if you don't have access to hemp seed, you don't really need it. Which is that this is going to add a little bit of extra nutrition and really healthy oils to this recipe. Because it's kind of fun to think about cooking without waste. We have these little scraps from the squash that we just did. And I'm going to throw those right in there too. So I'm just going to give them a rough chop because they're going to get all blended up. We have all this pulp that can go in there too. Because it's really important to think about like just trying to find a use for everything, you know, because our indigenous communities and our ancestors had to be extremely resourceful in life, you know. Our indigenous ancestors didn't have the privilege to be wasteful, and they had thousands of generations to teach them what to do with stuff. So instead of throwing things away that have flavor and nutrition and are fresh, why not use them right away? And if you don't have access to a food processor, you could use a blender, but food processors are pretty easy to come by. They're not too expensive, and I see them all the time at thrift stores even. So the only thing I'm wasting here basically is these two little pieces. That's the only part of the squash that's not going to get used for something. All right, so then what I want to do is puree this up really good first. We want to break up all those seeds, and I'm going to add a little bit of oil to this, and it's probably going to be, again, about a quarter cup, but like I said, we'll have these recipes written down for you to refer to. And then I am just going to, and we're just going to make a really nice paste out of this. So think of it like making like almost like a, it's almost like peanut butter, but you're using sunflower seeds mostly and the pumpkin seeds, and you're kind of just making a really loose paste. So, okay. And then we are going to add a little bit of salt. We'll taste it for salt in a little bit too. I'm going to again add a little bit of pure maple to this. This will probably be maybe 4 tablespoons. I'm going to add just a little bit more oil because I need it to be just a little bit looser. And then all we're going to do is add some of these fresh greens to this. So I'm just going to rough chop some of this kale, pop that in there. I've got some of this dandelion. And I'm not too worried about the stems because it's all going to get pureed into a sauce. And we're just going to throw that in there too, real simple like. And just a little bit more kale. Okay, now we're going to start this again. Then we're just going to give it a little bit of a taste for salt. Just a tiny bit. It's pretty close. And voila. If you look at this, it looks just like a regular pesto, basically. This is such a versatile dish. If you wanted to loosen this up with some more oil and maybe add a little bit more agave to it or maple syrup or something, you could basically just have this wonderful dressing, to dress salads. You can pour it over vegetables. You can use this as a sandwich spread. You can basically do whatever you want to. There's no rules for it. So, all right, so this is nicely roasted and beautiful. Yeah, this is perfect right now. A little bit of pesto on top also. And I'm just going to garnish with just a tiny bit of oil. A little bit of that sumac that we used on the squash. And a little bit of the pepita seeds that I'm just going to break in my hand and just kind of use this as like a garnish. And something so simple, so nutritious, and that's just really all you need.